The Old Testament or Hebrew Bible is rich with the voices of prophets, individuals chosen by God to deliver divine messages to the people of Israel and sometimes to other nations. These prophets played a significant role in guiding, warning, and consoling the people, as well as interpreting events through the lens of divine will. They were often tasked with calling the people back to faithfulness, foretelling future events, especially concerning judgment and restoration, and proclaiming God's promises. The prophets are traditionally divided into two categories: the major prophets and the minor prophets, not by their significance, but by the length of their writings. The major prophets Isaiah is often considered one of the greatest prophets in the Old Testament. His ministry took place during a turbulent period in Israel's history, covering the reigns of several kings of Judah. Isaiah's prophecies span from warnings of impending judgment due to the people's sinfulness to promises of redemption and hope. The book of Isaiah is often divided into three sections. First Isaiah, chapters 139, primarily focuses on the impending judgment against Judah and the surrounding nations due to their sin and idolatry. Isaiah warns of the coming Babylonian invasion and exile. Second Isaiah, chapters 40-55, speaks of comfort and hope for the exiled people of Israel, proclaiming that God will restore them. It introduces the theme of the suffering servant, which Christians later interpreted as a prophecy about Jesus Christ. Third Isaiah, chapters 56-66, continues the theme of hope and restoration, envisioning a future in which God's people are returned to their land and live in peace and righteousness. Isaiah's messages are filled with visions of the holiness of God, and he frequently emphasizes the importance of trust in God over political alliances.
Jeremiah, often called the weeping prophet, had the challenging task of prophesying during the final years of Judah before the Babylonian conquest and exile. His ministry spanned more than 40 years and included periods of intense opposition and personal suffering. Jeremiah's main themes were judgment and repentance. He warned the people of Jerusalem about their impending destruction because of their unfaithfulness to God. He was deeply grieved by the stubbornness of his people, often expressing his sorrow over their fate. Jeremiah's prophecies included the destruction of the temple, the exile to Babylon, and the eventual restoration of the people. One of the most famous passages in Jeremiah is the prophecy of the New Covenant, Jeremiah 31:34, in which God promises to write his law on the hearts of his people, signifying a more intimate and internal relationship with him. Lamentations. Though not a prophet himself, the Book of Lamentations is traditionally attributed to Jeremiah. Lamentations is a poetic expression of mourning over the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC. The book is structured as a series of dirges, expressing grief, lament, and a profound sense of loss over the devastation of the city and its people. Ezekiel was a prophet during the time of the Babylonian exile. He was among the first group of exiles taken to Babylon, and his ministry took place while he was in captivity. Ezekiel's visions and symbolic actions are some of the most vivid and strange in the Bible. He often used dramatic symbolic acts to convey his messages to the people. The book of Ezekiel can be divided into three sections: Judgment on Judah and Jerusalem, chapters 1-24. Ezekiel condemns the sins of Judah, particularly its idolatry, and warns of the destruction of Jerusalem. Judgment on the nations, chapters 25-32. Ezekiel delivers oracles of judgment against foreign nations such as Egypt and Tyre, who either oppressed Israel or rejoiced in its downfall. Restoration of Israel, chapters 33-48. After Jerusalem's fall, Ezekiel shifts his message to one of hope and restoration. This includes the famous vision of the Valley of Dry Bones, symbolizing the resurrection and restoration of Israel. Ezekiel also includes detailed visions of a future restored temple and a reconstituted priesthood, which have been interpreted in various ways throughout history. Daniel. The book of Daniel is unique among the prophetic books because it blends narrative stories with apocalyptic visions. Daniel was a Jewish exile who rose to prominence in the courts of Babylon and Persia. The first half of the book contains famous stories, such as Daniel in the lion's den and the fiery furnace, while the second half contains complex visions of future kingdoms and the coming of God's eternal reign. Daniel's prophecies focus on the rise and fall of empires and the ultimate triumph of God's kingdom. His visions of a Son of Man coming in the clouds, Daniel 7:13-14, have had a lasting influence on both Jewish and Christian eschatology. Daniel's life and ministry were marked by unwavering faith in God, even in the face of persecution.
The minor prophets are 12 shorter prophetic books, often grouped together. These prophets addressed various issues, ranging from social injustice to idolatry, and spoke to both Israel and Judah, as well as to foreign nations. Hosea's primary theme is God's steadfast love for an unfaithful people. His marriage to an unfaithful wife, Gomer, serves as a living metaphor for Israel's relationship with God. Despite Israel's infidelity, Hosea proclaims that God's love remains and that he will ultimately restore his people. Joel's main focus is the day of the Lord, a future time when God will judge his enemies and bless his people. Joel calls for repentance in light of a devastating locust plague, which he interprets as a precursor to greater judgment. Amos, a shepherd from Judah, delivered a harsh message of judgment against Israel for its social injustice and religious hypocrisy. He denounced the wealthy for exploiting the poor and called for justice to roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream, Amos 5 verse 24. Obadiah is the shortest book in the Old Testament, consisting of a single chapter. It focuses on the judgment of Edom, a neighboring nation that had mistreated Israel during a time of crisis. Obadiah prophesies the destruction of Edom and the eventual triumph of God's people. Jonah is unique among the prophets because the book focuses more on the prophet himself than on his message. Jonah was called to preach to the Assyrian city of Nineveh, but he initially fled in the opposite direction. After being swallowed by a great fish and delivered by God, Jonah reluctantly preached to Nineveh, leading to their repentance. The book emphasizes God's mercy and compassion, even for non-Israelite nations. Micah's prophecies focus on social injustice, particularly the exploitation of the poor by the rich and powerful. He also predicts the destruction of Jerusalem but promises that a remnant will be restored. One of Micah's most famous passages is his prophecy of a ruler from Bethlehem, often interpreted as a messianic prediction, Micah 5 verse 2. Nahum's message is a prophecy of the downfall of Nineveh, the capital of Assyria. Unlike Jonah, who witnessed Nineveh's repentance, Nahum foretells its complete destruction because of its cruelty and oppression. Habakkuk is distinctive for his dialogue with God, in which he questions why God allows evil to go unpunished. God reveals that he will use the Babylonians to bring judgment, but they too will eventually face judgment. Habakkuk's prayer of faith at the end of the book is a powerful expression of trust in God despite difficult circumstances. Zephaniah warns of the coming day of the Lord, a time of judgment for Judah and the nations. However, he also speaks of the future restoration of a humble and faithful remnant who will experience God's salvation. Haggai's ministry took place after the return of the exiles from Babylon. His primary message was to encourage the people to rebuild the temple, which had been neglected. Haggai promises that God's presence will return to the temple and that its glory will surpass that of the previous one. Zechariah, like Haggai, prophesied during the time of the rebuilding of the temple. His visions are highly symbolic and focus on God's ultimate victory over evil and the restoration of his people. Zechariah contains several messianic prophecies, including the vision of a king coming to Jerusalem on a donkey, Zechariah 9 verse 9, which Christians associate with Jesus. Malachi, the last book of the Old Testament, addresses the spiritual apathy and moral decline of the returned exiles. He rebukes the priests for their corruption and calls the people to faithful worship and obedience. Malachi also foretells the coming of a messenger, who will prepare the way for the Lord, Malachi 3 verse 1, which is interpreted in the New Testament as a prophecy about John the Baptist. Conclusion. The prophets of the Old Testament played a pivotal role in shaping Israel's religious and ethical life. They served as God's messengers, warning of judgment, calling for repentance, and proclaiming hope for restoration. Thank you for watching this channel. Please like, subscribe and get notified for more videos.